I'll start it now. Um, I should assign somebody every week to remind me to start the recording. Um, but huh?
I signed it.
So right. So I have given Seir to Esau for an inheritance. So don't provoke them to war because you won't win. All right. Meaning, so not so much as a footstep. So he explains the pshat, the literal meaning, as he understands it first. Even only for the sole of the foot to tread a single step, I do not permit you to enter their land without permission, right? So like there's not even like a de minimis, right? In other words, you say, well, yeah, I trespassed on their land, but it was only one footstep, so it shouldn't count. No, it does count, right? Not even a footstep, right? That's the literal explanation. The agadic explanation is, I will not give you of their land until the day arrives when the foot will tread upon the Mount of Olives, as it is said, and his God's feet will stand on that day upon the Mount of Olives. Right now, we have a couple of brackets here. The Messianic era and his God's feet will figuratively stand on that day, right? Because the translator, right, the verse from Zechariah does not say God's foot will figuratively stand on the Mount of Olives, right? It says God's foot will stand on the Mount of Olives, right? But the translator doesn't want you to think that God literally has feet, right? Or that he thinks God literally has feet, right? So he adds those brackets, right? But in other words, if you read this midrashically, all right, so we have this messianic prophecy in Zechariah that how will we know that the Messiah is here? One of this will be that God, right? God's foot will stand on the Mount of Olives. So in other words, midrashically, so what Rashi is saying here is that God isn't saying to us, we will never inherit their land. We will never have their land. We will have their land. But when? Right? In the Messianic era, not now, right? It's a world to come thing, not a current world thing, right? And if you tie this, I mean, and I think, to me, the tie is there, right? I mean, we know, most of us know, because I've discussed it in classes and in sermons and so on and so forth, right? That when Zionism arose, right, the Orthodox rabbinate was almost entirely opposed to Zionism, right? And the Haredi objection to Zionism, which still exists, is precisely the same objection, right? I mean, nothing wrong with living in Eretz Yisrael, right? Nothing, right? You have, hundreds of thousands of Haredim who live in Eretz Yisrael who reject the legitimacy of the state, right? In varying degrees, right? From people who now participate, or, well, they don't participate now because they're not in the coalition, but they would participate in the government, to people who are happy to take benefits from the state but not contribute to the state, to people who literally won't even touch Israeli currency, right? And everything in between, right? But what's the theological basis for their rejection of Zionism?
God was supposed to provide the land. This was man.
Right. God will, exactly, right? You see that it's the same dynamic in this Rashi, right? Right. Don't provoke them. Don't you go deciding that now is the time to fight them, right? Because I decide if and when you fight them, right? And if you fight them now without my permission, you won't succeed. You'll have their land. You will have their land, but you'll have it at the end of days.
What can I do?
After the Messiah, right? So don't provoke them now, right? And that is, I mean, if you read, like the Satmar Rebbe Yoel Taiwan, that's exactly it. This whole idea of provoking the nations, right? Don't provoke them. Don't provoke them. Okay. Because I have given Mount Seir to Esau for an inheritance from whom? From Abraham, right? From Abraham, and this is why it's necessary for Rashi to stress the fact that Bnei Esav, the descendants of Esau, are our relatives, right? Why are they our relatives? Because Isaac and Esau were brothers, right? And who was their father? Abraham, right? So they are also descendants of Abraham. And so when I promised Abraham that his children would receive the land of 10 nations, all right? So what is the tally of those 10 nations, right? 10 nations, but there's the 7 Canaanite nations, right? 7 is not 10, right? I mean, Stan, you said the other day that I'm still not good at math, and you're right.
Yeah, I know.
But even I know that 7 is less than 10, right? So if there's a promise to Abraham that his descendants are going to inherit the land of 10 nations, and we've inherited the land of the 7 Canaanite nations, right? Well, 10 minus 7, I think that leaves 3, right?
Right.
So where are the other nations? Okay. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, who are Ammon, Moab, and Seir, right? Hakeni, Haknazi, Hakadmoni, these are the Ammonites. In other words, different names for the Ammonites, the Moabites, and Seir. One of them is for Esau, that is Seir, and the other 2 are for the children of Lot. Why? Because Lot went with Abraham to Egypt and kept silent when Abraham said, oh, yeah, she's my sister, right? So he treated him, that is to say, God treated him as Abraham's son to inherit part of the land promised to Abraham, right? So even though Lot was actually Abraham's nephew, God counted him as a son in terms of inheritance, right? So if there are 3 sons and 10 nations to be inherited, right? But it doesn't have to be split evenly, right? So Isaac gets 7 and Lot gets 2 and Esau gets 1. Right, and that's how you get the 10 nations, right? So that Esau is as much a descendant of Abraham as Jacob is, and therefore right? So God still has concern for them too, right? So you can pass through their land if they permit you, right? But ochel tishberu mitam bekasef v'achaltem. You must buy your food from them with money, and then you can eat. V'gam mayim tichru meitam bakasef ushtitem. You shall buy water from them with money, and you may drink, right? So there's two different verbs, there's two different shorashim, tishberu, okay, which is a little bit more obscure word for those of us who know modern Hebrew primarily, right? But one of the oldest department stores in Israel is Hamash Bir HaMerkazi. Hamash Bir is like the one who provides, right? And if you look in the Joseph story, that verb appears a lot, right? That they heard Shamu sheyesh shever b'Mitzrayim. They heard that there's provisions in Egypt, right? And yaradnu lishbor ochel. We came to buy, right? We came to buy food. Okay, so it's not an unknown verb, but it's a more unusual verb. And all right, so what Rashi is trying to do here in the Tichru Lashon Mekach, all right, so in other words, right, this is just like if you this is a straight language issue, right? It's an unusual word, and therefore Rashi wants to explain to you what it means, because you might not know. All right, so it means an expression of purchase, right? And he gives you another example in Genesis, right? Which I have purchased, asher kariti li, shekem be'krachei hayam karin lemichira kira. In the coastal cities, for the word selling michira, they use the word kira. Okay. Now, any comments or thoughts on this? Right, it's a little bit technical, but I find it interesting. Because Rashi is, I don't want to say whether acknowledging or claiming, because I don't really know, right? And I don't know how much Rashi actually knew about different dialects of Hebrew between the central area and the coastal plain, if there were indeed. But that's what he's saying, right? That in the coastal cities, they have a slightly different dialect of Hebrew, right? And instead of saying michira, they say kira, okay, which is not, look, not impossible, right? I mean, we see letters drop off of words all the time, right? So it's possible that the mem dropped off, although I'm sure a linguistics professor would say that's crazy, and they're two different shorashim entirely. But I don't know linguistics all that well. Okay. Right. The Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hand. He knows of your walking through this great desert. These 40 years that the Lord your God has been with you, you have lacked nothing. Right? For the Lord your God has blessed you. All right, we know that, right? Therefore, you should not be ungrateful for his goodness to you by acting as though you were poor. Rather, show yourselves as rich people. Right? Marcia, you're smiling. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the thoughts of not poor, thinking that all they did was fetch through the whole trip.
Right. For sure. Right. For sure. Right. But it's, I mean, I don't know. I find this a really interesting comment,
Yeah.
right? And that you know, almost verging on the prosperity gospel. Right? I mean that I mean, I don't know if anybody else watched this movie that's on, I think it's currently on Netflix, The Eyes of Tammy Faye, which is about Tammy Faye Baker and that whole scandal that was in the 80s. But that's the prosperity gospel, right? That no, so Gail, you could shake your head and make a face, and I agree with you, right? But it's out there. It's out there, right? And you know, and we could debate whether these people are actually sincere or not, right? But there is this idea that wealth is a blessing from God, right? Wealth is a blessing from God. So far, so good, right? I mean, that's the whole point, right? That's the whole point, right? That we recognize that wealth is a blessing from God, right? Don't say, you know, my strength got me this. I have all this because I'm so strong and so brilliant, right? You have it because God allows you to have it, right? Because God is the ultimate source of everything, right? So far, so good, right? But the prosperity gospel then pushes that and says, you know, if you have a lot of wealth, it's because God likes you, right? And the more God likes you, the more wealth you'll have. And therefore, you know, enjoy your wealth and live big and live ostentatiously, because it'll show people how blessed you are because of your faith, right? And therefore they'll want to be rich too, so they'll emulate you and blah, 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 right? I mean, it verges almost on that, right? Which I think is problematic, right? Is problematic. I mean, it's one thing. I mean, I'm not saying, you know, that you should like walk around looking like a pauper either, right? But to, I don't know, to sort of ostentatiously, I don't know, to me, this comment of Rashi is a problem, is a bit of a problem. Val, Val, you want to say something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Do we have any idea where the action takes place in the today's Middle East?
Yeah, this is southern Jordan.
Southern Jordan.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, they're in Transjordan and they're waiting to cross over. Okay, so this is basically southern Jordan.
Because I was wondering if anybody else would claim that they own that area.
Yeah, the people who live there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the people who live there, the Moabites and the Ammonites. I mean, in fact, it's not even really southern Jordan. I mean, they're in southern Jordan, but they're going to go north to Jericho and then cross over into the land, right? So I mean, and we know, I mean, from, look, at least in Hebrew, right? Let's say if you're standing on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem, right? And you're looking east into Jordan and you see the mountains there, right? That's Hare Moab, the mountains of Moab. Okay. And so that's the Moabites. And the other nation referred to is the Ammonites, right? And what is the capital city of Jordan?
Amman.
Amman. Amman. It's the same word, right? In Hebrew, it's Rabat Ammon, okay, which means the Rabbah, which means big, of the Ammonites. But it's called Amman, and it's continually being called Amman because it's the capital of the Ammonites, right? I mean, this is, place names in particular are very, very conservative, right? And they may change form a little bit as the language changes, right? But archaeologists know where a lot of the biblical cities are because the Palestinian Arabs still use basically the same name for those places, right? And, I mean, I remember, like, when I lived in Norwich, Connecticut, okay? Norwich, Connecticut is the kind of place where you are considered a newcomer if your grandparents were not born there, right? And, I would ask, where a certain place was, and they'd say, oh, it's in Ames Plaza. Okay, Ames Plaza. And then I'd look and I'd try to find Ames Plaza. No, right? Because Ames department store went out of business 40 years ago, right? But they still call it Ames Plaza because place names are very conservative, right? Place names are very conservative. So these are definitely like known places that are still going by the same names, 3,000 years later. For sure. All right.
So is there any similar interdiction to the return home besides not bothering these people?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a whole complicated theological question, right? I mean, there is the Talmudic concept of the three oaths, okay, that after the destruction of the temple, right, there was that we swore that we would not try to return home, right? And in return, the nations of the world swore that they would not oppress us excessively. Okay, now define excessively, right? And it's interesting that, historically, the majority of world Jewry did not become Zionist until the Holocaust, right? Which, you could say that theologically they broke their oath, which releases us from ours, right? But historically, look, historically, Zionism was a secular, not only secular, but secularist movement, because they said, we're tired of waiting for God to act, right? We're tired of waiting for God to act, so we're going to act on our own, right? And the synthesis only became essentially, oh yeah, God helps those who help themselves, right? But absolutely, I mean, it's a complicated theological question, right? And there, the Haredi, the so-called ultra-Orthodox community, is still mostly opposed to political Zionism, right? Precisely for these theological reasons, absolutely. All right.
Okay.
So, but I just want to, let's look at the next verse, right? And I don't even have to look at the commentary. I just want to look at the verse. We departed from our kinsmen, the children of Esau, who dwelt in Seir, right? We've seen that. By way of the plain, derech ha'areva, ha'arava. Okay, the arava literally means the plain. Now, I lived in the arava for 2 years, okay? The arava is the valley between the mountains that are in Israel and the mountains that are in Jordan, right? The mountains of Moab, right? And we, by way of the plain from Elat, right? And from Etzion Gever, right? Etzion Gever. Elat is still Elat, right? Elat. Now, maybe. I mean, basically, in 1948, there was a British police station there and nothing else, right? But because of this verse, they decided that it's Elat, and so now it's a major city, and they called it Elat. But chances are, and there are archaeological remains. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of the archaeological remains are either on the Jordanian side or kind of like too close to the border to be able to really be excavated, right? But Etzion Gever is probably Aqaba, but Elat is Elat, right? So these are like known places, right? And we pass through the way of the desert of Moab. Okay, we know where the desert of Moab is, right? And the Lord said to me, do not distress the Moabites, and do not provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as an inheritance, because I have given Ar to the children of Lot as an inheritance, right? So the Moabites are descendants of Lot, okay? And once again, you shouldn't provoke them, right? Because they, you shouldn't provoke them because I've given them this land because they're descendants of Abraham too, and it's their land, and you're not going to succeed in taking it away from them, right? So don't provoke them to war, okay? Now, va'al titgar bam milchama, right? Whereas in the previous verse, for the children of Esau, it says, do not provoke them, period. Al titgaru bam. Right? But here it says, Al titgar bam milchama, right? So in the previous verse, it said, don't provoke them. And here it says, don't provoke them to war, right? What's the difference between not provoking them and not provoking them to war? Right? I mean, that's the question that Rashi's asking. And he answers, he says, God forbade Israel only to wage war against Moab, but they did frighten them, appearing before them armed for battle. Therefore, it is written, and Moab was very frightened of the people. This is back in the book of Numbers, because Israel plundered and looted them. Okay, so God basically says, don't go to war against them, right? But you can steal from them. You can loot them, but you can't wage war against them, right? Whereas the Ammonites, you can't even do that. Do not provoke them with any kind of provocation as a reward for the modesty shown by their ancestress, Lot's younger daughter, who did not publicize her father's conduct, as did his elder daughter, who named her son Moav. Me'av, from the father. Okay, this is a little complicated, right? But if you remember, right, remember what happened after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And Lot's daughters were afraid that the whole world had been destroyed, right? So they had sex with their dad, right? But the younger daughter did not publicize her father's conduct, but the older daughter did. How did she do it? Because she named the son Moav, right? And Rashi is doing a folk etymology here. Moav meaning may of, right? From my father, right? So not only did she have a son fathered by her father, right? But she named him, right, in Me'av. She named him, I got pregnant by my dad, right? I don't know, as if they're like in Alabama or someplace. I shouldn't say things like that. Right, okay. All right, so verse 10. The Amim dwelt there formerly, a great and numerous people, and tall in stature as the Anakim. Okay. The Amim dwelt there. But this is all way, way, way before this, right? You might think that this is the land of Rephaim, which I promised to Abraham, because the Amim who are Rephaim dwelt there before, but this is not that one. For those Rephaim I drove out and made the children of Lot settle there instead. Okay, so there are all these ancient people, right? By ancient, I don't mean ancient to us. I mean ancient to them, right? 3,000 years ago, right? And the Anakim, I mean, in modern Hebrew, Anak means a giant, okay? But the Anakim were a race of people who were, allegedly very, very large. And the Anakim are also called Rephaim, or there's the Amim are as big as the Amim and the Anakim and the Rephaim, and the Rephaim so we call them Anakim, but the Moabites call them Amim. All right, now, like a critical biblical scholar will tell you that this was all added later, right? This was all added later to clear up confusion about who these different nations were. I don't know. I don't think it really matters one way or the other. But it's just trying to look at these different nations. Why are they called Rephaim? Because whoever behold them, his hands became weak, Rapha. All right. Yadav mitrapot. Raphe means like weak. Okay, so if you looked at them, right, like you looked at them and you became so scared that you became weak, right? Why? Because they were, these gigantic folks. Okay, and why? So that's why they're called Rephaim. All of this is folk etymology. And why are they called Amim? Right? Because they cast Amah over everybody, right? If you looked at Ema, meaning fear, right? If you looked at them, you became fearful, all right? And the Horites dwelt in Seir, and just as I gave the Rephaim over to the children of Lot, I gave them the Horites over to the children of Esau. Right, so because the Horites dwelt there before, and the children of Israel were driving, children of Esau were driving them out. You know, what's the point here? I mean, I don't know that we really need to know all these details of the different nations and so on and so forth. But what is the larger sort of, let's call it, theological historical point? Right?
It was telling us we are not alone there.
Right. It's not right. We're not. It's not exclusive to us, right? I mean, in other words, yes, God cares for us, and because God cares for us, God gave us victory over these other nations, right? But the fact that God cares for Israel doesn't mean that God cares only for Israel, right? And God cared also for the Moabites and the Ammonites, right? Because they're also descendants of Abraham. And just as God drove out, and this is the reason why scholars think that this is added later, right? Because it's describing God as having driven out the nations of Canaan before we've even entered Canaan, right? It's describing the victory in the past tense before it's even occurred, right? So, which would lead you to conclude that it was maybe written later, right? But the theological point, and it's the same thing that God makes in some of the prophetic books as well, right? That yes, Jews, I love you. Okay, but the fact that I love you doesn't mean I love you only, right? I love other nations. I've rescued other nations. I've granted victory to other nations. Right now, of course, you might say this is very nice, but if I'm a Canaanite, right, or one of the Rephaim, or one of the Amim, or one of the, well, it doesn't do that much for me, and I get that, right? But nevertheless, the idea that God's providential concern is not only for Israel, I think is an important point. Okay, so now, if in verse 16, so Moses is kind of wrapping up this idea. So it was when all the men of war, Vayihi ha'asher tamu kol anshe hamilchama lamut mikerev ha'am, when all the men of war finished dying from among the people, all right, that the Lord spoke to me, saying, when all the men of war, meaning, right, so after the sin of the spies, right, that's when God condemned us to spend 40 years wandering in the desert. So 38 years left, right? When would we be able to go into the land? When all of the people who were involved in that particular sin had died, right? And that's what's happening now, right? That the Lord spoke to me. But since the spies were sent until now, which this is a bad translation, it's missing the word not. since the spies were not sent until now. That is to say that, not that they weren't sent. Aval mishloach hameraglim ad kan lo ne'amar b'parasha zu. The sending of the spies has not been mentioned in this section yet. All right. So only vayomer is said and not vayidaber. Okay. Now you may say, what's the difference, right? But according to the rabbinic understanding, right? Vayidaber, and God spoke, right? And vayomer, God spoke or said. What's the difference between vayidaber and vayomer? Okay, vayidaber is like when God is speaking affectionately, right? But vayomer is when God is speaking less affectionately, okay? So all this entire period, God, it only says vayomer to teach us during those entire 38 years during which time the Israelites were under ban by God. The divine speech was not directed towards him in an expression of affection face to face and with peace of mind, to teach us that the divine presence rests upon the prophets only for Israel's sake. Okay, a little complicated, right? But in other words, so for this 38 years, right, for this period of 38 years, God is alienated from Israel, right? God is alienated from Israel. And therefore, when God is speaking to Moses, he's speaking to him, let's say, matter-of-factly rather than affectionately. Okay? Now, why? Moses didn't do anything wrong, right? Moses didn't do anything wrong, right? So if Moses didn't do anything wrong, why is God speaking to him matter-of-factly rather than affectionately? And the answer is that the whole point of God speaking to Moses at all was not for Moses' sake, right? It was for the sake of the Israelites, right? And if God is upset with the Israelites, he's going to take it out on Moses, essentially, right? Because Moses, right, his speaking with Moses is instrumental. It's for the sake of the people. It's not for the sake of Moses himself, okay? But the men of war, men from 20 years of age who go forth to war, right? So everybody 20 years of age or older in that generation died, okay? And then the nation could get ready to go into the land because all the people who had been involved in that specific sin had passed away. All right, so we'll wrap up here. There's a few more verses, but you know, I'll give you these verses in 2 weeks, and you know, probably some more as well. All right, any questions? All right, be careful in the snow, and be careful with this virus. I found out today that's somebody with whom I was in the same room within the last few days tested positive for COVID. So now we have to go for COVID. I mean, it's an old story. We've all been through this, you know, but as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. Right.
Yeah, just quarantine and forget it.
What?
Just quarantine.
Yeah, I know, but you know, not every, but, and I probably will, but I didn't know until like early today. And if I had quarantined from the time that I found out, we would be without food for the week. So, you know, this is an issue. I mean, from,
Oh.
you know,
So now everybody at Modi's has to quarantine.
right now everybody at Modi's has to quarantine, exactly.
Okay.
I'll let them, well, only if I test positive. Right, because nobody else with COVID has been in there the whole week, I'm sure.
Right.
Absolutely.
Do you have any home tests?
I ordered some, but they haven't arrived yet.
Mm.
They haven't arrived yet, but I was one good thing about Kaiser is that you're able to get appointments quicker than with most others. So I'm going on Sunday. So I could have gotten an appointment for tomorrow, and in fact I did have an appointment for tomorrow, and then I said, oh, I forgot it's going to snow.
No.
It's not worth it. All right. Good night, folks. Shabbat shalom.
Be
Yeah,
well.
Shabbat
Shalom.
Shabbat
Bye-bye.
shalom.
Yasher Koach.
Bring to you.